Hello class, I'm Justin Hoshaw and I will be your instructor for biology, Principles of Biology. And as we go through this flipped class, I would like you to pay really good attention when you're listening to these lecture slides, write down notes, and if you have any questions, please bring those questions into class. We'll spend the first few minutes of class reviewing any questions to make sure that you really understood everything that I wanted you to get out of these lecture slides and reading the chapter. So here we are, we're going to start with Chapter 1, View of Life. Now, with biology, when we're trying to look at what that is, it's simply the scientific study of life. Now, there's a lot of diversity in living things, and we just look around us, and whether you're looking at bacteria in the soil or a whale in the ocean, those are both living organisms, and we define that based on several characteristics that we're going to go through here. Now, first of all, living things are all composed of chemical elements. Those are the same chemical elements as non-living things are composed of. So the same carbon that makes up you and I also makes up the desk or table that you're sitting at right now. They also all obey the same physical and chemical laws like everything else in the universe, whether it's a living organism or a non-living table, desk, what have you. So as you can see in your book, whether it's bacteria, paramecium, morel, mushroom, sunflower, and octopus, all of these things are all considered living organisms, and that's because they have very similar characteristics that we can go through here. So now the first characteristic of life that we're going to look at is that living things are organized. And the levels of biological organization range from atoms all the way up to the biosphere. And within those, the cell is the basic unit of structure and function for all of the living things that we look at. Whether you're a unicellular organism, uni being one, or a multicellular organism composed of many cells, you're all using a cell as that basic unit of structure and function. Now, each level of organization as you go up is more complex than the level preceding it. And as biological complexity increases, each level has new emergent properties. Now, with emergent properties, that basically means that if you're looking at a molecule, you can't just take a couple molecules and stick them together and get a cell. It doesn't work like that because that cell has emergent properties that you can't break down into smaller pieces and still get those same functions. And those emergent properties are very special to biology. You get a lot of things that the cell can do that molecules can't do, or that tissues can do that cells aren't able to do. And that continues to go up whether you're looking at organs, organ systems, or the whole organism itself. So this is very unique and special to organisms. Now, the second characteristic that we'll look at is that living things acquire materials and energy. And let's just look at energy at first here. Energy is the ability to do work, to get something done. It's required to maintain this organization that life has and conduct the life-sustaining processes such as chemical reactions that we'll talk about later on. So we get into some of the details of metabolism later in the semester, and you should basically know now that metabolism consists of all the chemical reactions that occur in a cell. These chemical reactions allow for the release of energy and for that organism to use that energy in order to get other tasks completed. Now, when you're looking at where the energy for all these chemical reactions come from, it is the sun. The sun is the ultimate source of energy for nearly all life on Earth. And that's because plants, algae, and some other organisms capture that solar energy and perform photosynthesis. That photosynthesis converts solar energy into chemical energy that other organisms can use. It's not just the plants or the bacteria that are using that, but eventually it travels up the food chain and you have every living organism on the planet utilizing that energy. And we wouldn't be able to be here if it wasn't for those plants converting that energy. So you can see whether you're a tree, an eagle, a human, buffalo, bison, all of these organisms are all acquiring nutrients and energy. That's how they keep sustaining themselves and going on. Now the third characteristic that we look at is that living things need to maintain homeostasis. Homeostasis is the maintenance of internal conditions within certain boundaries. So the ability to maintain a state of biological balance is homeostasis. You're not going outside those boundaries. And there's a few really good examples where your blood needs to maintain a pH of 7.4. If you go more than 0.4 in either direction, you can suffer from life-threatening conditions. Now, in order to make sure you maintain that homeostasis, you have feedback systems in your body that maintain internal conditions and then make adjustments based on the information they receive. Now, the fourth characteristic is that living things respond to stimuli. So whether you're interacting with the environment or responding to changes in your environment, that's a stimuli that you have to react to. So for animals, this ability of response usually produces movement. So you can see the penguins sliding on ice there. The fifth characteristic is that living things reproduce and develop. All living organisms must reproduce to maintain a population. And the manner of reproduction really varies among different organisms. You have sexual reproduction, asexual reproduction, and we could talk about either one of those for an hour each at least. Now, these organisms, when they reproduce, they have to pass on copies of their genetic information, or genes. And we'll talk about this quite a bit later on in the semester. But these genes are going to be passed on to the next generation, and that determines the characteristics of the next generation or that next organism. Now, genes are composed of DNA, and DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. And we'll look at the structure of DNA a bit later as well. Now, the last characteristic is that living things have adaptations. And an adaptation is any modification that makes an organism better able to function in a particular environment. And it's important that we're looking at a particular environment, because you may have one adaptation that allows you to do really well in one environment, but if you change those environmental conditions, you might be at a detriment. Now, the diversity of life that we see is because of long periods of time organisms have responded to those changing environments and developed new adaptations. And when we look at this development of new adaptations, we're talking about evolution. Evolution is the change in a population of organisms over time so that population can become more suited to the environment. It's not individual organisms that are changing, but you have small changes in one generation over another generation, and then those changes build on each other. And that's what we're looking at when we talk about evolution. Next semester, if you take Principles of Biology 2, you'll look more at evolution and how it works. In this next section, we focus on evolution a bit more, and it is really important that you understand this because it's a unifying concept of biology. It links a lot of different aspects together so that we can really understand life on our planet and how it came to be. Now, the theory of evolution explains all this diversity as well as the unity of life. It suggests where organisms came from and how they descended from a common ancestor. So we see common descent with modification. And what this means is that you had one population, and over time that population split up into different groups, and one group evolved one way with a particular set of environmental conditions, and the other half of that group may have evolved differently because of different environmental conditions that pushed the organisms in a completely different direction. And there's a lot of different examples of this on our planet, and we can even see some of these examples occurring right now. There is another theory, and that's the theory of creationism. Now, I would not be the best person to explain the details of that. If you want some really good information on that, you can go to the Creationist Museum in Kentucky, and this animatronic robot will explain those details for you there. Now, when we look at evolutionary trees, we see that it's like a family tree. An evolutionary tree is going to trace the ancestry of life on Earth to a common ancestor. So the first cells on our planet originated right here. And as they grew, you had one group split off and become the bacteria. Another group split off and became several different things. You have the archaea, and then you have the eukarya. And within the eukarya, you have protists, plants, fungi, as well as animals. So we are actually more closely related to fungi than we are plants. Now, when you look at an evolutionary tree, you want to start focusing at the common ancestor. And as you go through, you're going to see that it splits, and at that split or that node, you could actually switch these two groups. So if you wanted to have archaea on the top, you could put that right here and bacteria below, and at this point it would mean the same thing. So just because you're looking at one group of organisms at the top here doesn't mean that bacteria is more advanced or more complex than archaea. That's not what this representation is meaning. This just means that these groups split at the node and continue to develop until right now. So as we go on, you can see that there was another node, and here you had eukarya split from archaea. And that continues on. You have protists, plants, fungi, as well as animals. And again, keep in mind that you're going to start at the past and then work your way to the present. So because all these organisms that we're looking at today have all been on this planet the same amount of time as all the others. So you don't really have one being more complex than the other. What's happened is that you've had different environmental conditions that have affected how these organisms grow and develop. And that pressure pushes them to develop in a particular direction. So when we're looking at all this diversity, we want to make sure that we can organize it in such a way that it's easy to understand and follow. So for that we have taxonomy. Taxonomy is a branch of biology that's responsible for identifying, naming, and classifying organisms. And then we also use systematics to study evolutionary relationships between organisms. And within this we have classification categories. It starts from the least inclusive and goes to the most inclusive category. So we start with species and then go to genus, family, order, class, phylum, kingdom, and domain. Now, I really try not to focus a lot on memorization for this class, but this is one of the few things that I do want you to memorize the order that we have these categories in. You know that species is the least inclusive, domain is the most inclusive. So each successive category above species has more types of organisms than the one before it. I also like to point out now just how much pressure evolution can put on organisms. Here we have a phylogenetic tree that starts with a common ancestor, and one group split off and became the common shrew. Now another group separated and became the African golden mole as well as the African elephant. Now when you look at these two organisms, they seem completely different. And for a long time scientists thought that these organisms were distantly related. But when we looked at the DNA evidence, we started to see that the African golden mole was actually more closely related to the African elephant than it was the common shrew, even though physically they look very similar. Now this is the same thing with horseshoe crabs. Horseshoe crabs look very similar to other crabs that you'll see in the ocean, but when we look at the DNA evidence, we see that they're actually more closely related to spiders than they are other crabs in the ocean. And horseshoe crabs, I think, are very interesting just because it's kind of like a science fiction organism. Their blood uses copper instead of iron. So their blood's not actually red like ours, but it's blue. And the blood is very important because we use it to purify injections. There's chemicals in the blood of the horseshoe crab that are great at removing bacterial toxins left behind. Currently, we use bacteria to grow a lot of vaccines and other drugs, but as they're producing these drugs, they're also producing toxins. Those toxins would result in fever and even death if they were just injected into people straight. So in order to remove these toxins, we filter the drugs through horseshoe crab blood, and that removes a lot of these toxins, and we can then inject the drugs into people. Now, this brings up analogous traits and homologous traits. Analogous traits are features that are produced by convergent evolution, meaning that different organisms in different places were exposed to the same environmental conditions and that forced them to develop similarly. So you had the horseshoe crab that was in the ocean and developed as a horseshoe crab, and then other crabs that, again, were in the ocean and developed as those crabs because of the same common environmental conditions. Now, with homologous traits, you have features that are inherited from a common ancestor. So if you're looking at birds in Europe and then birds in the Americas, they both have wings, they're both flying because they inherited those traits from a common ancestor. Now, usually in class I have students do a class activity, but right now I'd like you to take somewhat of a break, maybe get up, stretch your legs, and then come back and write out what are the common characteristics of life and why do living things require an outside energy source of nutrients and energy, and then describe those. So you can pause this video now, take a few minutes to do that, and then when you've completed that, we can go on. Now look at the levels of classification. So remember, I wanted you to remember the order of these categories, and your book has some examples there, so I'd like you to look over this table. In order to help you remember this hierarchical system, remember you have inclusive categories at the top, and then you're going down to the bottom, and at the bottom you have more exclusive categories. So there are a few devices to help you remember the order of this, such as keep pond clean or frogs get sick. King Philip came over for good soup. But whatever helps you remember this, that's what I'm interested in. So if you need kids put condoms on for great sex, people can often find good sex. Whatever works for you is fine with me, but I do want you to remember this. The three different domains I would also like you to memorize are archaea, bacteria, and eukarya. Now with the domain archaea, this consists of unicellular prokaryotes that live in extreme environments. So first off, the word prokaryote means that these organisms lack a membrane-bound nucleus. And we'll look more at cell structure a bit later on. But these archaea live in such extreme environments that for a long time people didn't even bother looking into these environments to see if anything lived there. So we don't know a lot about them because we haven't been studying them for that long compared to bacteria or eukarya. So now looking at the bacteria, this also consists of unicellular prokaryotes, and these bacteria live in all environments. And we're actually covered with bacteria on our skin, in our body. Our bodies are actually composed of more bacterial cells than they are eukaryotic cells. So now we can look at the domain eukarya, and this contains unicellular and multicellular eukaryotes. So eukaryotes contain a membrane-bound nucleus. And that's very important for you to understand that a difference between eukaryotes and prokaryotes is that prokaryotes don't have a nucleus and eukaryotes do have a nucleus. We can look at a bit more detail of the domain archaea now. They are prokaryotic cells and they have a number of different cell shapes. As I said before, they've adapted to extreme environments. So very salty conditions, very cold or very hot environments. They're also able to absorb or chemosynthesize their food, meaning that they can take methane or carbon dioxide and oxidize other gases in the environment to make any of the chemicals that they need to survive. Now, there are some other unique chemical characteristics of archaea, focusing on their cell wall, and we won't get into the details of that here, but you should be aware that the cell wall of archaea is different than the cell wall of bacteria. So in the domain bacteria, you again have prokaryotic cells of various shapes, and these cells are adapted to all environments. So they can live in refrigerator conditions, they can live in very warm conditions. In some cases you can't kill them just by heating them up. They can form spores. They are also able to absorb, photosynthesize, or chemosynthesize their food. So it's not just plants that go through photosynthesis, but it is bacteria as well. And then we also have some unique chemical characteristics, mostly related to their cell wall. Now in the domain Eukarya, we have protists that consist of algae, protozoans, slime molds, water molds. Some of these organisms can even go through photosynthesis. So again, it's not just bacteria and plants that go through photosynthesis, but it could also be protists. And then we have the kingdom fungi that consists of your molds, mushrooms, yeasts, and ringworms. And these are mostly multicellular organisms that have very specialized complex cells. They absorb food from their environment by actually excreting digestive enzymes and then absorbing that food. And then we have the Plantae kingdom. This consists of your algae, mosses, ferns, conifers, flowering plants. These are multicellular plants with very specialized tissues that contain complex cells. And these organisms do go through photosynthesis. And last we have Animalae. These are sponges, worms, insects, fish, frogs, turtles, your birds, and mammals. That is where we come in. These are multicellular organisms that again have specialized tissues that contain very complex cells. I like to show this slide because it emphasizes just how much we're continually reworking the classification and organization of life on our planet. With new information, with more advances in technology, we need to look at our data and see, okay, does this need to be changed? So with the domain archaea, we've done this by just holding off, and we're looking at the kingdoms and how we should divide up archaea to better suit evolution. And then we're also looking at bacteria and figuring out how these bacteria are related to each other, and hopefully in the near future we'll have a kingdom designation for bacteria. Now with Eukarya, we're a bit better at our kingdoms. We have fungi, Plantae, and Animalae, but we also have protists that are actually composed of several different kingdoms. But we group them together here so that you can see some of the common similarities between those protists. Now, with scientific names, we want them to be universal and Latin-based. We have a binomial nomenclature, meaning it's a two-part name. The first word is the genus, and this is always going to be capitalized. The second word is the species designation or specific epithet. This is always written in lowercase. Both words, when you're writing them on the computer, are italicized. So you can see below Homo sapiens, referring to humans, or Zemes, referring to corn. The H in Homo sapiens is capitalized, sapiens is lowercase, the Z in ze is capitalized, and the M in maize is lowercase. Now, we don't focus on natural selection a lot, but it is a very useful evolutionary mechanism that was first proposed by Charles Darwin. Now, some aspect of the environment selects which traits are more apt to be passed on to the next generation. So individuals with favorable traits are going to produce the greater number of offspring that then survive and reproduce again. This increases the frequency of those traits in the population. Now, mutations are the fuel for natural selection. Mutations introduce variations among members of a population, and then natural selection works on which mutations are better suited for that environment. And if they're not helpful towards that environment, then they'll be eliminated. Your book has a good example of what would happen if a mutation occurs in a plant that deer were eating. That mutation would cause the leaves of the plant to become hairy. Now, deer wouldn't prefer eating hairy leaves, and quite frankly, neither would I. So they're going to prefer eating the other smooth leaves. Now, because they're eating those leaves, the plants with the smooth leaves have to put more energy into making more leaves. And that means less energy into making seeds and offspring. So as the generations continue on, you have the plant with hairy leaves producing more seeds and more offspring, which is kind of taking over the forest. And the other plants are, again, still spending a lot of energy producing more leaves, and they're getting eaten even more. Until eventually, you have the forest that's dominated by plants with hairy leaves and just a few plants that have smooth leaves. So this gives you a good idea of how evolution can carry a new mutation from just one or a few individuals to the rest of the population in an area. And this concludes the first part of Chapter 1 that I wanted to go over with you here. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to this lecture, and I hope you found it helpful. If you have any suggestions for how I can improve these lectures, please let me know, and I'll try to incorporate that as we go on in the semester. But I look forward to talking about this information more with you in class. See you soon. Bye.